had a question about human nature. Now, you visited other physical matter realities, and it's all consciousness existing in these realities, physical, non physical. But as human avatars, are there differences in what we call human nature because of our specific history here? Or is all consciousness subject to these human nature traits?
No, there are traits that are very specific to us and our experience. For instance, humans evolved in this virtual reality. They evolved with instincts like everything else. Instincts just mean memory. They have memory that isn't like our memory that we go into and remember what grandfather looked like or did he have a beard or not. It's not that kind of memory, like a memory of the body, memory of the species, memory of the culture. And these things, these instincts, are different for different kinds of people who had different kinds of experience. They're not all the same. So if you grew up, when I say you grew up, if you, your species, hominids, Homo sapien in particular, if Homo sapien grew up in a very violent world, then it's going to be one way. It's going to have a bunch of instincts and attitudes that have to do with dealing with that violence. If it grew up in a very bucolic world where everything was happy and food was plenty and didn't need shelter and everything was available to everybody so that there was no need to be violent. You know, you needed something to eat, you just had to stop and pick it off a tree. If you had that kind of a background, then that would evolve entirely different kinds of attitudes and strategies for getting by and getting ahead. So the things we've had to deal with are particularly ours because of the things that we've dealt with. Now, Homo sapiens only been around about 200,000 years as Homo sapien. The chain that ended up as Homo sapiens been around longer than that, but Homo sapiens been around about 200,000 years. Well, that's not very long. If you look at geological time, 200,000 years is like the last eye blink in time. It's not that long. So Homo sapiens, one of the latecomers in the game of critters, and we have instincts just like every other animal has instincts, and they have to do with how we evolve, the strategies we used in our evolution. So that makes us different than people say that grew up in a world that was not so violent as ours was. Ours was a very tough place to grow up. That creates a different kind of critter than one that's not tough to grow up.
So, this human nature thing is particularly applicable to us, to our reality here. And
As
there
to
are
our reality, you take a
different
different world, a different
types.
virtual reality that was a different kind of
Mm.
space. It maybe wasn't generated the same way our virtual reality was. Maybe it had different kinds of rules. You make a virtual reality by specifying the rules. Here's the rules of how things have to happen in this virtual reality. So you have a different virtual reality, and some critters grew up in maybe that virtual reality. And in that virtual reality, maybe there was no need to eat. Food wasn't an issue, and there wasn't any weather either. I can think several non-physical realities I've been to where food and weather weren't issues. Now,
Oh
mostly
my.
they weren't realities that we would call physical, because when we talk about physical, we're talking about stuff and
Hmm.
so on. But they're realities where entities have lived and have always lived in those virtual realities, and they grow up a certain kind of person. But we have these instincts. You might call it collective consciousness.
Hmm.
That might be one of the ways to understand what is an instinct. It's a collective consciousness. And those things are stronger in some people, weaker in other people. They're not all the same. Even in animals, the human's just another animal. It's another animal that evolved here. And sometimes, I think I've mentioned this before, I had a female cat, a stray cat that came, and of course, like female cats do, got pregnant and had a bunch of kittens. And this particular female cat had no clue what to do with those kittens. Would not feed them, would not let them nurse, would not take care of them, wouldn't go grab them up by the back of the neck and bring them back to safety. It just like, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And "Leave me alone," was its attitude toward its own kittens. So its maternal instincts were just missing. It didn't have strong maternal instincts, and all those kittens had to be bottle fed. They all had to be fed a drop at a time out of little bottles with little nipples and so on until they got old enough to eat regular food, or they would have all starved to death. So there's an animal that just had a very weak instinct. And of course, there's other animals that know exactly what to do with those kittens, to feed them, to take care of them, to bring them to safety, to do all that. That's just part of their instinct. That's just the way that's just the way their reality is put together, that they feel that way. So instincts aren't something that are like stamped on us and they're all exactly the same. But most of the humans have bunches of instincts that center around survival and procreation. Those are the two big things in our virtual reality that meant you survived or you didn't survive. You didn't survive. How good were you at procreation as a species and at survival as a species? If you weren't good at either one of them, then you became extinct. You didn't last very long. You had to be really good at both of those, and they're linked to each other. So those were the ones that survived, the ones that were good at that. So a lot of our instincts are around being good at survival and at the procreation. So that's who
And
we
that's in
are. It's the same
general
with,
across
yeah,
the board
that's
with
general
all
across all,
with
yeah,
all physical reality.
yeah, with all animals. We're not always going to be just the way we are now. We may physically change, emotionally change, mentally change to suit the environment that we live in
So it's
better.
the environment that gives us these human traits, this nature of how we are.
Yeah, it gives us some of them. Some of the peculiarities are environment induced. Yes.
Mm.
Some of them have to do with the way we live. You take a bunch of people who've always lived in a big city and take a bunch of people who never had more than 5 or 6 people around them ever because that was just their family and they lived on a farm out in in a farmland someplace and it was an hour's walk to the next farm. So they just grew up with 5 or 6, 7 people around. That's it. Well, you'll notice that those 2 groups of people are different than each other. They see the world differently. They experience the world differently because they've had 2 different sets of environments that they grow up in. So people who have lived their whole life in the jungle of Amazon rainforest are going to have different attitudes, different opinions, different ways of thinking than other people.
Quality of consciousness is a factor as well. And when I say human nature, those things that make people do what they do, that's environment and consciousness quality.
All of those things, and it's
Hmm.
other people. It's
Hmm.
the interactions you have with everything outside of you and the interactions you have with things inside of you. You have awareness and you're aware of the outside stuff, which is other people and stuff, all of that. Your environment. Your environment could be pleasant or it could be pretty mean. So you have all of that coming on, but then you have awareness of the inside of you too. your feelings, your emotions, your beliefs, your attitudes, and that's all the inside world. And the inside world and the outside world are constantly interacting with each other.
We were discussing the PMRs, the physical matter realities outside of our reality. You've often mentioned a very difficult, not pleasant physical matter reality that you've dropped into.
Mhm.
It always was interesting to me, but now, in light of this, are the people who inhabit that faced with bigger challenges than we're faced with? And do they get more credit for being in a reality like that? Or have they made such bad choices collectively that they've been placed in that?
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above are possibilities and mostly true. Most of the various worlds that I've been in, universes that I've been in, that are physical like. In other words, they have a real tight rule set that defines all the interactions between things. They're very highly interactive and they have rules. Like in our virtual reality, the rules are basically our science. It's the physics, the chemistry, the biology sets the rules. Well, psychology too, sociology, they all set the rules. You live within these rules and you evolve with these rules. Some have had very violent evolutions for their last 200,000 years, or however long their species has been around. Some have not. It just kind of depends on the place and the way it evolved and so on. So there's some differences there. But for the most part, what I've seen has been similar to what we have here. And I thought at first that that was very unusual. I expected greater variance, greater differences than what I found. And at first, of course, I had to ask myself, well, is that just me? Am I seeing what it is I'm used to seeing? Is that the problem? I'm interpreting all the data to be similar to the data I've interpreted here. Is it me with an expectation of things being a certain way? So I had to go many times to many places to see whether it was me imposing my own expectations or not. So, if you're a scientist, this is the way you have to live your life. You question everything, be skeptical of everything. Okay, I saw less variance than I expected. I expected them to be just completely different kinds of places, but they weren't. Yeah, of course they had differences, but for the most part, they were pretty similar. There's more similarities than there were differences. And then I thought about it and I said, well, what makes those differences? For the most part, it's two things. And these are connected things, and that is the organism itself, what it's capable of doing, like a humanoid, like us. We have opposable thumbs and so on. So we're big builders. We can produce all sorts of interesting things that none of the other animals do that. They pretty much deal with their environments in a creative way, and that's about as far as they go, as far as building and architecting and coming up with gadgets and machines and computers and things that add really fast and so on. We kind of are the exception to the animals here in the things that we accomplish. A lot of it has to do with these grippers we got here, and other has to do with the way we put things together in our head, the way we have developed through very difficult times that always pressed us for for survival. So because we were always pressed for survival, we always had to be smarter. We always had to find a way. We always had to develop a tool because most of the other animals that are bigger and meaner than we are and would have us for dinner, they see better, they smell better, they move faster, and they're stronger than we are. So we're kind of at a disadvantage. We don't run very fast. You know, our sense of smell is not very keen. Our eyesight's fairly good, but we don't see in the dark very well. A lot of animals see just fine in the dark and in the daylight, both. So we're at a disadvantage, and we had to be clever and we had to work together. We had to cooperate in order to survive. Well, that made us kind of different. That cooperation and caring forced us to think more, to plan more, to be more creative, to come up with better ideas. We were kind of pressed to either come up with better ideas or not survive. So we were forced as a species to do that by our surroundings for one. So we kind of developed differently. If we just had to hang out in the trees and eat bananas that happened to be there, and the biggest deal we'd have to deal with is moving over to the trees on the other side of the hill, and eat bananas there because our bananas would run out. That was about the biggest problem we had. Then you develop differently. So anyway, we developed because we were always pressured and pushed to come up with creative solutions that enhanced our weaknesses. And that's why we turned out to be the way we are, that much different than other critters. We're kind of unique because we didn't just fit nicely into our environment. We struggled. And indeed, of the half a dozen hominids that walked around at that time that would have been something like us had they grown and continued to survive, they didn't make it. They became extinct and disappeared. We're not a very survivable species in the beginning. So we had to be smarter. We had to think. We had to procreate in voluminous ways. We had to have more children survive. And we had our own strategies for doing that. That's why Homo sapien kind of won the hominid lottery because we produced more children that survived than anybody else.
And
Yeah.
with these other physical matter realities, humanoid like some of them, they
Well, a lot
went
of them
through a
have humanoid-like
different,
things. Yeah.
but they went through
But
a different evolution.
they did. But my point that I'm getting around to in a long wandering kind of way, the way I usually do, is that if you're going to generate a virtual reality and find one that's stable long enough for it to evolve critters of interest, that's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. That's why we have those 5 cosmological constants that are all tuned to each other to 10 decimal places, because it had to be that finely tuned so that it didn't crash. When I mean crash, I mean it didn't become unstable and self-destruct. You got a lot of forces that have to be balanced, right? You got gravity pulling everything together. Well, if gravity just wins, then everything ends up in a big smush in the middle. If the gravity's not strong enough, everything just flies away and disappears. So you need to have balance between lots of things to make a stable universe for the, 4 billion years it takes to develop and evolve humanids that survive. So it's hard to do. So I think what the system does when it finds something that works, it tends to start with something similar. And it starts with something similar, but it'll have different environments, it'll have different pressures, it'll have different starting points with different kinds of things that evolve. So they're going to be different, but at the same time, there's always gravity, more or less, but it's just the gravity fits the things that live there pretty well because they've evolved to live with that gravity. So similar ways. They have systems like us where there seems to be suns that come up in the east and set in the west and go around. There's things like that that happen. So you go these different places and the sun still comes up. And you say, well, the sun's always come up, or is there just places that just are warm and stay that way? For no apparent reason. They're just made to be warm. Well, I wouldn't find those. The things I'd find kind of looked like here, though the details were different. But they were very similar to what we have here, and I think it's because it's really, really difficult to produce a virtual reality that will generate and evolve something that the consciousness is looking for to make choices by, that it ends up being very similar.
Well, when you interacted with some of the people, you've done this in a few places. You've interacted with the beings there physically and non-physically. What did you notice about the nature of those people? How were they different or similar to
Yeah.
us?
Well, like I say, most of the places were fairly similar. You ended up with a hominid, looks sort of like us, with a head and two arms and two legs and opposable thumbs. And it may be that the larger conscious system said, all right, I got a system here that works pretty good. We'll always start out with something like that, or most of the time we'll start off with something like that, and then we'll just start with there and let it evolve from that point. No sense necessarily redoing the five constants that all have to be balanced for each other. We may just take that and reuse it. That might be a thing, but we'll give different environments and different attitudes and different kinds of things that we will develop there. Different amounts of plentiful food or not so plentiful food, or different amounts of shelter, different kinds of weather patterns, and we'll see. So it could be just that. It doesn't start always at a big digital bang. It may start somewhere in the middle because that's just more convenient for the system, doesn't have to wait so long. So there's things like that that could be going on. But I found a few. Now, most are very similar. Some few are very dissimilar. There aren't hominids with heads and arms and opposable thumbs. There's all kinds of goofy looking creatures that you wonder how they ever evolved because they're so unique. And I don't know how they ever evolved. It's something you look at somebody, you can't tell where they came from. But there's been some of those. They're just in the small minority where you had those kinds of things. But in those that were very different, had different kinds of things that weren't like humans, they still had the same interactions going on among them. Now, in this case, they all communicated telepathically, but they had similar communications. They were all social systems where the entities had to work together and cooperate and so on, because that's what consciousness wants. It wants big social systems where you can learn to become love through interaction with others. So they all kind of had that as a general theme. But it wasn't always humanoids, but mostly it was humanoids, but not always. Sometimes there was bizarre things there that you'd think would never evolve anywhere. And maybe they were just put there. The system may have said, all right, we're going to start like this one was. We maybe take this model and start it at about 4.5 billion years. And then we'll people it with some other kinds of creatures. Who knows what the LCS did to create these various virtual realities? I doubt that it just repeated the long start from the big digital bang and let's see what happens. That probably was the initial run. But after that, my guess is it didn't always go back to that step to start over. It started over somewhere partway along, changed the things it wanted to change, maybe change the environment, change the kind of individuals that are in there, and then see what happens with that. So there's some of them that are very implausible. If you looked at them, you'd say, this doesn't even make sense. but there they were. But they were social systems of these entities, and they communicated, and they fought with each other, and they had control, power, force issues. Some wanted more control and power and force than others, and it was mostly
The same human nature.
issues the same old issues were going on, even with
Okay.
these people that it's hard to describe what these people look like. They
We
weren't
can get you an
humanoid.
artist to do an artist sketch if you
Yeah,
want.
yeah, they look, you know those toys where you have this thing like this and it wobbles around on a
Weebles?
base that's curved, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and you toss rings over it.
Mm-hmm.
You can fill it up full of rings and so on, and it's meant to aid a very young child's eye-hand coordination. They were built sort of like that. They were kind of pointy at the top, wide around the bottom, had a curved bottom that they could move around with. So it was a thing that, to me, from my viewpoint, probably wouldn't evolve anywhere. It may have just been placed there. I don't know. But I doubt, like I say, that the system went back and started from scratch every time. That wouldn't make sense.
Do you think we were the initial Big
I
Bang?
think I think we probably were
Mm.
the initial virtual reality that evolved from scratch, and then the IUOCs were kind of pushed a little to go log on and make the choices for this group. And yes, I think we were the initial one. I think we started from scratch, but I think that the system probably meddled with it some. Oh, it's not working too well. Let's let's change this. Let's do that. Oh, those great big lizards are eating everything. We need to make room for the smaller ones because these big lizards are very limited in what they can do. They're not very smart, but they're good predators. So we maybe need to have a asteroid land and kill all the vegetation for
Sure.
a while so that the little guys could get out and find room to romp and
That's
play and
logical.
exist. Things like that, the system may not have just been accident. Things like that that we see in our history, in our evolution, may have been purposeful so that
Mm.
the system meddled a little bit with it in order to get more of what it wanted. And maybe making this transition from a chimpanzee to a human was a little problematical. So they kind of fiddled with that a little
Mm-hmm.
bit to make a difference there
Different.
of
Mm-hmm.
how that worked so that it'd be more like what they wanted. So yes, anybody who has that kind of a stimulation is going to fiddle with it to make it come out the way they want it. So no doubt those things you'll have things where they don't have a continuous path. It's not like
Right.
here's a continuous path that goes from a single cell all the way up to a human being. There's going to
Mm-hmm.
be break in these paths, and not just
Right.
because we don't we haven't uncovered the missing link yet, but just because it all wasn't just natural evolution. I'm sure the system poked it and
Adjustments.
pulled it
Mm-hmm.
and made adjustments to get what it wanted out of the final product.
Well, you've noticed that the conflicts and the kind of human nature of control, power, force struggles, you've noticed that in these other physical
Yeah.
matter realities. But on a one-to-one level, do you have anyone that you connect with on a one-to-one level? And what is their mindset and their thinking? Is it very much like ours?
Most of the realities I've been in is very much like ours. I say they're mostly humanoid type people. You know, we'd recognize them as human beings if we saw them.
And they
Oh, they
think
may
as
be,
we do, or
yeah,
they have the
roughly,
same priorities or things like that.
roughly, they're full of fear and control power forces, what rules the day, and so on. Yes, mostly that's kind of the common denominator is that they're struggling to evolve just like we're struggling to evolve. I think we've been doing it a little longer. I think we were probably one of the first, but the system would be silly to put all of its eggs in one basket. Because if we just get up to a certain point and then we bomb ourselves back into the stone age and then we get back up to a certain point of capability and we bomb ourselves back, the system's going to have to intervene and cut that cycle somehow, get us past that point because we just can't seem to get there on our own. It might do that after we bombed out a few hundred times. It may decide it needed to butt in and help us. So yeah, I see that kind of thing, the struggle, the fear, the ego, the beliefs, all the same kind of problems I see in all these things, whether they look humanoid or not. They're social systems. They have a dominant advanced type, and that dominant advanced type builds a culture, builds a civilization, make governments, becomes farmers, form cities, make social alliances and social compacts with each other. So all of that is generally common because that's the nature of consciousness. Starts out
Gotten
low quality and has to build itself up to higher quality. So has to go through all that stuff, and it needs to be social stuff because just pieces of consciousness, each one in its own cave, doesn't evolve the way it needs to because they need to be social creatures. So I always find them in connection with others of their kind.
Did you ever get into a conversation with one on one and discover what their particular struggles were, or what was the conversation that you might have had with
Yeah, I
just
did. I
one
did that
being?
lots of times. I had a lot of conversations with them. It was just like it was similar to us, just different. They had their own issues, their own problems. For the most part, they, like us, had children. Children had to grow up. They had adults. They had some nice people, some not nice people. It was it was similar in those kinds of ways, even if their structures and the way they communicated and what they looked like was very different. They still had most of the same sort of thing. So I think they were still products of evolution, not just something that the system put there, but products of some kind of evolution. You have to see that when I do that, I visit. I'm one person, so it's not like I fly over whatever it is they're living on and get a bird's eye view of it, and then I read history books, and then I see geological surveys. I don't get any of that. I get plumped into a situation. I'll meet 5 or 10 or 20 of these things, or maybe only 2, and I have conversations with them. Usually that's because I'm in a body with them. So I talk with them, and I can't just be too stupid because that would blow my cover. My cover is that I don't cause any trouble. I don't make people freak out or anything. So I have to seem like them. So I have these conversations. I learn something about what they're doing, how they're doing it, what's what makes them happy, what makes them sad. So you get the idea, and then you're gone. So you're in this thing. You don't get a global view. You're not flying around in an airplane at 10,000 feet, inspecting, do they have crops and fields and farms, unless you happen to land on a farm. But mine has always been that experience of being there, like somebody just suddenly you found yourself in Boston
Yeah.
or Texas or
And you had a conversation with them, and
someplace, and you had a conversation with some people, and maybe you even hung out with them for a few days, and
and what makes them happy and sad is similar to what makes us happy and sad.
yeah, it's
It's so
pretty much
interesting.
the same. So I don't have that overview of what their culture was like and how did they elect their leaders or did they elect their leaders, or I don't really have that, but I do know that there was dysfunction. Some of
Yeah.
them didn't like others. They fought over issues that they didn't like. There was constant turmoil. That tends to be pretty much the same all over. So I didn't find places that everybody seemed to be totally happy and lived in plenty and everyone was low entropy beings of love. I didn't find that. I found a lot of struggle and a lot of ego and fears.
Well, thank you, Tom. I seldom insert a question of mine, but I had this come into my mind, human nature, and I know of your travels. I mean, all of this information speaks to your vast experience of testing and retesting and noting and experiencing what this larger reality is about, what this whole reality is about, and noting the different things about it is very intricate. And I appreciate that. And I was just zeroing in on how these people or these beings, are they similar to us in their worries and their struggles and their
Yes.
fears and all of that? And thank you for indulging me in a question that I came up with. I'm not sure that you've spoken quite to this question before,
No, I
but
haven't I haven't talked that much about it. Again, I don't like to talk about things that are outside people's experience, but this is kind of inside their experience because it's the same sort of stuff is going on everywhere in these various
people
virtual
would like to know that, the
realities.
struggles that they have are universal,
Universal. Yeah.
really universal.
Well,
So thank you for
consciousness
doing that.
consciousness is what we are. Okay, this is, inside the larger conscious system. It's about consciousness. Consciousness is a social system, entities interacting with each other. And through the quality of those choices in those interactions, you evolve or de-evolve at a faster rate. So all of these are peopled by avatars with a individuated unit of consciousness and free will awareness unit playing their part. You see, just like here. So it's all basically run the same out of the same larger consciousness system, but the system tries different things, different ways, and different kinds of things.
Diversity. No, this is where
Diversity,
diversity is a very important thing. We're
it
so
is.
provincial here. We're so concerned about a color or a difference of a lifestyle. And diversity is the thing that runs this entire reality. And it's what the larger consciousness system wants in order to grow.
Sure.
Is that right?
You learn more through diversity. If all you have is sameness all around you, you're not going to learn much.
Yeah.
That's not a rich learning environment. A rich learning environment must necessarily be very diverse or it's not rich. It's a poor learning environment. Now, if you woke up in a gray box, spent all your time in a gray box, and then died in a gray box, what would be the point? What would you learn? How would you grow? What kind of choices would you have? Obviously that would be the minimum of diversity. It's just you
or,
alone
or
in
only
a
people around you who were like you or who believed like you or anything that would be not a challenge for growth.
right. So that's why I think that it's an evolved system that requires evolution. It requires entities of enough sophistication and detail that the randomness in how those beings procreate, there's enough randomness in the procreation process that you create huge diversity. So, and we see that with people. There's a huge variation in how tall we are, huge variation in coloration, a huge variation in all sorts of things. There's just everything about humans and about other animals too is the differences, the things they deal with. There's always things in your environment that are going to help you, things in your environment that'll hurt you, things in your environment that couldn't care about you one way or another. And you have to deal with those things. So all of that is pretty much universal. It's how you deal with it. That's what's important. Do you deal with it with love and kindness and caring, or do you deal with it with anger and upset and control, power, and force? There's diversity among universes, Earth
Yeah.
like high level of rules,
Yeah.
universes like ours. There's diversity among them, so the system can see the kind of thing that works best. What sort of environment do the consciousnesses playing characters in that environment learn the fastest, do the best? Some are a little more gentle, some are more rough, some are this way and that way, but basically they're all social, they all struggle,
Mhm.
and there's fear is dominant. So some that were pretty good,
Mhm.
a lot that were terrible, some in between. But then the consciousness system showed me around. I happened to, get a tour. Not a tour like I saw one and then the next day another, but a tour here, go there for a few days and spend a week, live with a family, get a sense of what it's like. And then I'll show you, next week or next month, I'll show you another one. So you can't go to some place unless you have an address. You need to, in your mind, have an intent for an address. Well, when you've never been anywhere, you don't have an address book. You don't have any addresses. So you just can blunder around a little bit, which is what most people do. Or for me, I was in school. The system wanted me to understand the bigger picture. So it sent me places to experience. So that's why I have this repertoire of seeing a lot of things, but all of them kind of superficially, all of them from just a day or a week with a certain group of people that were at a certain spot. It's not the big
Certainly.
overview of the culture. It's not a study of their last
Sure.
500 years. It's just here, go live with them for a while.
A glimpse of that
Yeah,
culture.
and see what that's like. Mostly, it was kind of like living somewhere on the planet here. When I would go these places, I'd have to ask myself questions. Are you just bringing stuff up out of your own experience,
Hmm.
or are these actually different physical reality
Things.
frames?
Yeah.
And those questions like that are hard to answer, and the only answer you get is that you have to go to a lot of them. If you just had one experience, you'd never be able to come to any conclusions about that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You just wouldn't know. But when you have many such experiences, you start to see the pattern in them. And the pattern was that I was being shown different places just so I
Yeah.
would have an appreciation for what the larger reality
Yeah.
was and what it looked like. I
So,
didn't know that at the time. And it took many, many years before I put all that together and could tell the stories that I'm telling you now about the places I've been. Otherwise, it was just this collection of strange places.
hmm, hmm.
It didn't actually come together into a pattern until later when I realized that, I didn't just happen to end up in these places. I was sent to these places. I
Yeah.
was particularly given these experiences to help me have a bigger picture of what was going on. Now,
Yeah.
was was it accurate, or was it just the picture I was supposed to get and talk about? You don't know things like that, so you do your best, and like Bob, you report what you get the best you can. And there's bound to be some places in there where I was limited by previous experiences and so on. So probably not quite as many, hopefully, as Bob was, but because I was really shown around a lot of unique things that
Yeah.
didn't all pertain. Most everything Bob saw pertained to the Earth.
Yes.
Oh, this is the ring where people from Earth do this, and this is the place where people from Earth do that. And
Right.
everything seemed to be kind of
You
tagged
had,
to the
yeah,
to
you had
Earth.
no point of reference for any of the
No,
things that you saw, which edifies the experience that this was
yeah,
a different reality.
yeah. So I didn't have any Earth connections to any of that stuff. It was just different.
Yeah.
stuff in different worlds, all doing similar kinds of things in their struggle to survive. And
Once you have an address, you can return to those places that you've
you
been,
can.
and you
Once
have.
you've had an address, you can bring them up and you can return. But until you get the address, you can't go.
Have
So
you had
the
an update on any of the physical realities that you have been to? Do you check
I
on it once in a while?
get an update or two on some that I was wondered about, but mostly no. Mostly it was just for my own growth so that I would have a bigger picture. I was being prepared, I think, for talking about the bigger picture.
Yes, of
And you
course.
can't talk about the bigger picture unless you've been shown around a little bit to see what's there.
Well,
So
thank you,
I
Tom.
got
Yeah,
shown around.
I think this is a good example of the diversity and the vastness of your experience in creating your big toe from consciousness, from the outside in to our reality.
Well,
And
the thing is that people hear my idea of the nature of reality. It's a virtual reality that's computed by consciousness. And if they've never traveled around in consciousness at all, they're just hearing it from an experience in physical reality. It sounds kind of wild and crazy. A virtual reality computed in consciousness.
mhm,
That's kind of far out and hard to believe. But if they had had my experience, if they had had my experience with the paranormal things, I had my
yeah,
experience in traveling around in this reality, then they would realize that this model of mine, this model of consciousness, perfectly, perfectly suits and fits all of that experience. So I've
yeah.
got, I got close to 50 years of experience in the consciousness system. And this model I made up was first made up to fit those experiences in consciousness. Wasn't until a couple of years after I published my books that I realized, oh, they really also fit this particular virtual reality very well. I could derive physics from them, but mostly I came up with my model of consciousness based on a dozen or so different facts of consciousness that I had gleaned from my travels and explorations and so on within consciousness. And I had all these consciousness facts, and I needed a model that would explain them all. And I got that model, and then I found that that same model that explained all those facts of consciousness also would explain the facts of the virtual reality as well. So I know for other people, it's a hard sell to get them to wrap their mind around a paradigm shift as big as this is a virtual reality computed in consciousness is like a giant step. And they have trouble doing that. They can't wrap their mind around a paradigm shift that large. But for me, it was just one more step in a progression of things. So it's not that I one day said, what's the magic word? Eureka! You know, I see the world and how it's made. It
Right.
wasn't like that. I had
Lots of
lots and
experience.
lots of experiences inside of the consciousness reality that led me to a unified viewpoint of consciousness, which then wasn't that big of a paradigm shift to see how that also led to a unification of physical sciences and the physical world all just fell out of that same thing. So for me, I've got this experience base that's this big. Much of it is in the consciousness world. I also happen to be a physicist, so I understand this physical world over here too. And it all just is this one theory explains all of it. Whereas most people are only in this physical world, never been anyplace else. They look at it and hear me talk about a larger consciousness system making a virtual reality for individual beings of consciousness to grow up in. And that's kind of far fetched because they only have the small part of the story. They don't have the experience in the bigger part of the story.
It's a unique
And
combination, and it
that's
also speaks to, well, your your Center for the Unification of Science and Consciousness, certainly it speaks to that, but your experience also tells you that these other realities, these other physical realities that exist, are not reachable by a rocket ship. There's no
Oh, no.
traveling. It
No.
is in mind space.
This is all in mind
It's in
space.
consciousness. And that's, I think, a really interesting point that your experience can lend evidence to.
Yeah. Well, see, from my experience, that's a very simple conclusion to come to.
Of course.
Well, that's obvious, but without my experience, that's not obvious at all. So my problem is I'm trying to explain something to people who do not have the experience to understand it. And it's a big struggle for them to understand it just from the physical viewpoint. Is the only viewpoint they have. And from that viewpoint, this is just very outlandish and hard to explain. I spent almost a decade trying to find some other explanation, some other way, some other approach, and there is none. This is it. Consciousness is fundamental. This is a virtual reality created a consciousness, and I'm sorry it's such a big leap in paradigm, but it's just the way reality has to be put together. Now, from my viewpoint and my experience, it's almost trivial putting all that together. From somebody who has no knowledge except the physical, it's a great leap.
Well, you have some very credible scientists who have one foot in that understanding, not the big picture that you have, but certainly enough to be of interest to them. And thank you. This has been fascinating.
You're welcome.
I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member, because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you.